All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling racism, but with a twist. We're going beyond the usual US-centric view to explore how this issue plays out across different cultures around the world.
I think it's really important to step outside our own bubble. It's
Yeah.
easy to get stuck in our own perspectives.
Absolutely. So to help us broaden that perspective, we've got three really interesting sources lined up.
Ooh, lamb on me.
Okay, so first up, we've got this opinion piece from The Hill by Raul Lowry Contreras. He's making the case that racism in Mexico is a real problem, but it's often unacknowledged, kind of swept under the rug.
Interesting. I'm curious to see how he backs that up.
He delves into the historical context going all the way back to Spanish rule and the caste system they imposed, where skin color was the biggest factor in determining your place in society.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in school. Light skin meant you were at the top, dark skin, well, you were at the bottom.
Exactly. And to illustrate just how deep this goes, Contreras talks about gachupines, that's Gachupines.
Yachupines. What's that?
It's a word with Aztec roots, literally meaning a man wearing shoes with pins. It refers to the spurs worn by the Spanish elite, so basically a symbol of their power and dominance.
Ah, I see. So it's not just a neutral term for Spaniards. It's loaded with all this historical baggage.
Right. And he even quotes Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a key figure in Mexico's fight for independence, who famously said, "Death to bad government, death to the gachupines."
Wow, that's intense. You can practically feel the resentment simmering beneath the surface there.
Totally. But here's the thing. Contreras isn't just rehashing history. He's showing how these attitudes about skin color still impact Mexican society today.
Okay, so how does he make that connection?
He cites a modern study where Mexican children were asked to choose between a white doll and a darker doll.
Oh, no, I have a feeling I know where this is going.
Yeah, you guessed it. They overwhelmingly picked the white doll.
Ugh, that's so disheartening. It's almost like that study in the U.S. during the Brown v. Board of Education era.
Exactly. The one that showed how black children often preferred white dolls, internalizing the racist messaging they were bombarded with. It's crazy to think we're seeing similar results in Mexico decades later.
It's like a punch to the gut. It really highlights how ingrained these biases are, not just in one country, but across cultures. And what's even more troubling is that this bias isn't just limited to dolls. It plays out in real-life opportunities and how people are treated.
That's what makes Contreras' final point so powerful. He says Mexicans openly acknowledge their racism. That's something we rarely see here in the U.S., right? It's almost like we're afraid to even admit there's a problem.
It's true. We tend to shy away from those uncomfortable conversations. But maybe there's something to be said for that honesty, for being willing to confront the issue head-on.
Yeah, maybe that's a lesson we can learn from Mexico. But okay, let's shift gears for a second and talk about our next source, which is a real head-scratcher. This New York Times article dives into the surprising phenomenon of Latinos joining white supremacist groups.
Wait, what? That seems completely contradictory. Why would someone who is often a target of racism join a group that promotes white supremacy? Doesn't make sense.
I know, right? It's like, what's going on here? But to help unpack this puzzle, the article brings in former FBI agent Michael German, who actually went undercover to infiltrate these groups.
Wow, undercover. That's intense. I bet he has some fascinating insights.
He does. His theory is that white supremacy might be less about rigid racial categories and more about aligning with perceived power.
Okay, I think I'm starting to follow. So you're saying it's not necessarily about skin color itself, but about who's in control, who holds the power?
That's the idea. It's about siding with the perceived winners, even if it means perpetuating a system that ultimately harms you or people who look like you. To illustrate this, German shares a story about a white supremacist he met who was close friends with an Asian man. He even brought this friend to white supremacist events.
Whoa, hold on. That's wild. It totally challenges our assumptions about how these groups operate.
I know, right? It just doesn't fit the stereotype. And German's insights don't stop there. He goes on to say the groups like the Proud Boys strategically include non-white members.
Interesting. What do you think their goal is there?
It seems like a PR tactic, a way to soften their image and make themselves more palatable to a wider audience, maybe even try to deflect accusations of racism.
It's like they're using diversity as a shield, but it's so manipulative.
Totally agree. And it makes it even harder to understand their true motivations because it's all so calculated.
Absolutely. And then you have cases like Mauricio Garcia, the shooter in the Allen, Texas mall shooting. He was Latino, which really throws a wrench into any easy assumptions we might have about who joins these groups and why.
Right. It's not as simple as saying, oh, they must be self-hating or rejecting their heritage. There's clearly something much deeper and more complex going on.
German's point is that we need to look beyond those simplistic explanations and stereotypes. Each individual within these groups has their own unique story and set of motivations, and to truly understand the phenomenon, we need to be willing to explore those individual complexities.
It's like we're seeing how power dynamics play out in unexpected and often unsettling ways, with some Latinos fighting against a historical racial hierarchy in Mexico, while others align with white supremacists in the U.S., seemingly in pursuit of power. And that brings us to our final set of sources, the LA Times articles, which reveal another layer of this intricate web. They focus on anti-Black racism perpetrated by Latinos here in the U.S., particularly within California's diverse workplaces.
Oh, wow. That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear more about that.
One quote that really stuck with me was from Leon Simmons, a Black warehouse worker. He said, "When they look you right in the eye and call you the N-word to your face, that's dehumanizing."
That's just heartbreaking and infuriating. It's a stark reminder that racism isn't just some abstract concept. It's real people being hurt and marginalized.
Absolutely. And the articles go beyond just personal anecdotes. They detail two major EEOC lawsuits against Cardinal Health and Ryder Integrated Logistics, where hundreds of Black employees alleged a pattern of abuse, from racist language to discriminatory job assignments.
And what's even more troubling is that many of these allegations are directed at Latino supervisors and majority Latino workforces.
It's like a twisted kind of strength in numbers where shared ethnicity is being used to oppress another group.
It really challenges our understanding of how race and power operate, showing how anyone, regardless of their own background, can become a perpetrator of racism.
It's like that cycle of prejudice repeating itself, with one group that has experienced discrimination turning around and inflicting it on another.
Right, and the LA Times articles try to grapple with this question of why this anti-Black bias persists within the Latino community.
So what are some of the explanations they offer?
Well, they bring in Pew Research Center analyst Ana Gonzalez-Barrera, who suggests that centuries of history are at play here. She points to the legacy of slavery and the long history of colorism in Latin America, where a hierarchy based on skin color was the norm for generations. Basically, light skin was valued, dark skin was devalued.
So these attitudes aren't just individual prejudices, they're deeply rooted in these historical systems of oppression.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can't separate contemporary racism from its historical roots. It's all interconnected, which helps explain why a Latino warehouse worker might discriminate against his Black colleague, even though both could be considered people of color.
Wow, so we've gone from Mexican children choosing white dolls to Latinos navigating the complexities of white supremacy, and now we're seeing Black workers facing discrimination from Latino colleagues. It's a lot to process, realizing how deeply ingrained these biases are.
Yeah. It is. And I think we've only just scratched the surface. We've covered a lot of ground already, and I need a minute to let it all sink in. But there's definitely something connecting all these stories, some deeper truth about the nature of racism itself that we need to uncover.
I'm with you. We've definitely raised more questions than answers, but I think that's a good thing. It means we're pushing ourselves to think critically and to grapple with the complexity of this issue.
Yeah, it really makes you think. And those LA Times articles, those stories from Black workers facing racism from Latino colleagues and supervisors, really hit hard,
I agree. Those EEOC lawsuits against Cardinal Health and Ryder Integrated Logistics really highlight how insidious and pervasive this kind of racism can be. It's not just a few isolated incidents. We're talking about hundreds of Black employees alleging a pattern of abuse. It's systemic,
It is. It's disturbing to think that these cases involve Latino supervisors and majority Latino workforces, allegedly creating this hostile environment for Black employees. It's a reminder that anyone, regardless of their background, can become complicit in perpetuating racism.
It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people. But in this case, it's more like hurt people hurt other people who then hurt other people. This never-ending cycle of pain and oppression.
And what makes it even more complex is the power dynamics at play. So these Black workers are facing racism, but they're also terrified to speak up because they're afraid of losing their jobs. It's a truly awful situation.
It is. It highlights the urgent need for stronger worker protections and for companies to take these allegations seriously. We can't just dismiss this as interpersonal conflict or a few bad apples. This is a systemic problem that demands systemic solutions.
Absolutely. I think what we're seeing is that racism isn't this one-size-fits-all concept. It manifests in different ways depending on the cultural context, the historical baggage, the power dynamics at play.
It's like a chameleon, always changing its colors to fit the environment. But at its core, there's always this element of prejudice, this belief that one group is inherently superior to another, and that justifies treating them differently.
Exactly. And that's why it's so difficult to combat. There's no easy fix, no magic bullet solution. We need to be able to recognize it in all its forms and understand those subtle nuances if we truly want to dismantle it.
So how do we do that? How do we even begin to tackle a problem that's so deeply embedded in our history and in our cultures?
I think the first step is acknowledging the complexity. We need to move beyond those simplistic black and white narratives. We have to understand that we all carry implicit biases shaped by our upbringing and experiences, even if we're not consciously aware of them.
So it's about being honest with ourselves about our own potential biases and then doing the work to challenge them.
Exactly. It's a process of self-reflection, education, and being open to changing our perspectives. And it's about having those difficult conversations, even within our own communities. Because as these LA Times articles show us, sometimes the most insidious forms of racism can come from unexpected sources. It's not always about some far-off other. It can be much closer to home.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a responsibility to dismantle these systems of oppression. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to do it. We need to be actively challenging those biases, speaking out against injustice, and working to create a more just and equitable world.
And that starts with empathy, trying to understand the experiences of others, even if those experiences are vastly different from our own.
I love that because at the end of the day, we're all human beings sharing this planet, and we all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of our race, our ethnicity, or any other arbitrary category that someone might try to use to divide us.
Couldn't agree more. So we've covered a lot of heavy stuff today, but I think it's been a really valuable conversation. We've exposed some uncomfortable truths about racism and how it manifests in different ways, but we've also highlighted the importance of empathy, education, and taking action to create a better world. It's not enough to just say, oh, I'm not racist. We have to actively examine our thoughts and reactions, the assumptions we make about people based on their race or ethnicity.
So basically, we have to constantly check ourselves, like, hold on, where did that thought come from? Am I judging this person fairly?
You got it. And be open to the possibility that maybe, yeah, we are harboring some prejudices we're not even aware of. And then the tough part, doing the work to dismantle those biases. It's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process.
That makes a lot of sense. And it actually ties into those EEOC lawsuits we were discussing. Those situations weren't just about a couple of bad apples. It was about a whole environment that allowed those racist attitudes to flourish. We can't stay silent when we see things like that happening.
Silence is complicity, right? And this isn't just about calling out blatant acts of racism. It's also about recognizing those subtler forms of bias, those microaggressions that can fly under the radar so easily. A careless joke, a dismissive comment, that suspicious look, they all add up.
It's like we need to create a world where those kinds of behaviors are just unacceptable, a world where we hold each other accountable.
Exactly. And where we're always working to educate ourselves and each other, reading books, watching documentaries, listening to podcasts like this, anything that helps us expand our understanding and challenge our perspectives.
Okay, so we've talked about self-reflection, speaking up, and education. But is that enough? What about those bigger systemic issues that contribute to racism in the first place?
Here's the thing. I think those individual actions are exactly what lead to systemic change. The more people who are aware, who are willing to challenge bias, who are fighting for justice, the more pressure we put on institutions and governments to change.
It's like a ripple effect, starting small and then growing bigger and bigger.
Precisely. And remember, what we've talked about today is just the beginning. We focused on some specific examples, but this is a global issue.
It's almost like a giant tapestry, right? Woven from all these threads of history, culture, and power dynamics. And every part of the world has its own unique patterns of racism.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage you to keep exploring. Dive into the history of race and racism in other parts of the world. See how those expressions compare to what we discussed today. Because the more we understand the nuances, the better equipped we'll be to fight for a more just world.
Thanks for taking this journey with us. It's definitely given us all a lot to think about. And hopefully it sparked some important conversations for you too. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world around us.